Even the Kremlin can't order some fires to go out. On the night of June 14th, Ukrainian drones hit the Temp depot near Rybinsk, a facility that had already burned once on New Year's Eve. It came back, and this time the message was different. By morning, a black column stood over the town, visible for miles. The governor of Yaroslavl, Mikhail Yevrayev, did the one thing you only do when a situation slips out of your hands. He shut down every road toward Moscow. It wasn't an attack on the capital. It was a fuel depot 100 kilometers away. But that fire wasn't the point. It was just the only part you could see from the outside. Russia has learned to live with fire. For 2 years now, refineries, fuel farms, pipelines, somewhere in the rear, far from the front, something goes up in flames almost every week. People have gotten used to it. A burning fuel tank has become a kind of weather report for Moscow, unpleasant but routine. The war Ukraine fights in Russia's backyard is quiet. No tanks, no trenches, just small machines that fly 1,000 kilometers in the dark and strike exactly where no one expects them. Picture a boxer who doesn't aim for the face, but hammers the same rib round after round. At first, you barely feel it. Then one day, the arm won't lift. What's striking is the price tag. One of these drones costs less than a used car. The plant it sets on fire costs billions and takes years. Ukraine trades cheap for expensive, night after night, and the exchange rate runs in its favor. That's the uncomfortable math of this war. The side that attacks pays little. The side that defends has to protect everything at once, and can't. This night, though, was different. 3 regions, almost simultaneously the same handwriting. Rybinsk in the north, Vyazma in the west, and further south, a town called Novomoskovsk in the Tula region. 3 dots on the map that seem to share nothing at first glance. Look again, and they're a single idea translated cleanly into fire. For months, Ukraine's target list had revolved almost entirely around oil, refineries, the ports the crude flows out through, the tankers Russia uses to pay for the war in the first place. Oil is the account the Kremlin debits for every shell it fires, and for 2 years, Ukraine had been trying to drain that account. This night, the focus shifted, away from the harbor inland, away from what Russia sells, toward what Russia burns and builds itself. A small move on the map, a big one in thinking, because hitting an army's money weakens it slowly. Hitting its tools hits it now. And this is where the part of the story begins that Moscow would rather not bring up at all. Let's start where the black column stood. The Temp depot near Rybinsk belongs to Rosreserve, the state reserve agency. Translated, that means this is where the Russian state hoards fuel for exactly one occasion, the worst case. Not an ordinary depot, but a fortified emergency stockpile built for precisely the war Russia is fighting now. It's the iron reserve in the cellar, the one you only touch when things upstairs get tight. The facility had already been hit once on December 31st. Now, a good 6 months later, it was burning again. And that's the real sting of Rybinsk. An ordinary fuel farm is spending money it flows in. It flows out. Temp is the savings account. It's the reserve a state sets aside so it doesn't run dry when everything else is on fire. Hit the savings account and you're not just telling the other side, I burned your spending money. You're telling them, I can also reach what you hid for your worst day. According to the Telegram channels, Exelanova Plus and Astra, which were the first to report the operation, the drones struck in the early morning. And the reaction says more than any official damage report. Yevrayev shut down all traffic toward Moscow. Think about that for a second. You don't seal off a highway to the capital because a little diesel is burning. You do it when you no longer know what goes up next. Just under 300 kilometers further west in the Smolensk region lay the second target, Vyazma. Vyazma isn't a name people know in the West. For Russian logistics, it's critical. The town is a rail hub, one of those places where the tracks converge, the tracks that heavy equipment rolls forward on. Geolocated photos confirmed a fire inside a rail depot northeast of the central station. Now, rail depot sounds like nothing. In reality, it's the railway's workshop, the place where locomotives are serviced and made ready. Hit it, and suddenly you're short the engines that haul tanks, guns, and shells to the front. You don't have to blow up a single rail. It's enough to set fire to the hospital for locomotives, and the tracks beside it go useless. Vyazma isn't there by accident. It sits on the western supply axis. The line material moves forward on from the interior. Disrupt that line, and the equipment stops. Not destroyed, just useless, parked on some siding hundreds of kilometers from the front where it's needed. And then there was the main target. In the Tula region in the town of Novomoskovsk stands a plant with a strikingly harmless name, Azot, Russian for nitrogen. The governor of Tula, Dmitry Milyaev, confirmed the strike in his own way. He spoke of drone fragments that had fallen on the grounds of an unnamed industrial enterprise. Fragments, a word that sounds like an accident, like scrap falling from the sky. OSINT analysts at Astra cross-referenced the geodata from the videos of the fires and confirmed something far more specific, a blaze inside the Azot plant itself. NASA satellites registered the hotspots from orbit. And before we go on, how do we even know any of this? Russia rarely confirms hits like these directly. Instead, something falls from the sky, or a fire breaks out from an unclear cause. The gap gets filled by people who take videos apart frame by frame. They hunt the background for a chimney, a warehouse, a bend in a road, and lay it over satellite maps until the location is certain. That's how drone fragments on an industrial site became a confirmed fire at the Azot plant. NASA supplied the rest. Its satellites measure heat from space and flag every major fire. When a point glows that was cold yesterday, it's the governor lying, not the satellite. Two governors the same night, two languages. One talks about fragments. The other shuts the highway. Believe the one who acts, not the one who talks. But the fire isn't the interesting thing about this plant. The interesting thing is something that flowed out of it for years to a single address into one other factory. That address explains why Ukraine, on a night full of burning fuel depots, made a fertilizer plant its main target. It's the real reason this story is more than one more fire on a long list. We'll come back to that address in a moment. Keep it in the back of your mind. Because to understand what was really hit here, we have to stop talking about fire for a second and start talking about chemistry. Azot in Novomoskovsk belongs to the Eurochem group. It's the largest producer of ammonia and nitrogen fertilizer in all of Russia. On paper, then, a plant that feeds the fields, not the war. A place for farmers, not generals. On paper, because the same chemical processes that make fertilizer also make the building blocks of explosives. That's the unsettling thing about modern chemistry. The factory that grows your wheat can, with a barely changed recipe, supply the material that blows your neighbor apart. Nitrogen is both. Fertilizer and detonation separated by only a few steps. And here's where the address comes in, the one you're keeping in the back of your mind. Between 2022 and 2024, Eurochem's nitrogen plant shipped at least 38,000 tons of acetic acid and nearly 5,000 tons of nitric acid to a single customer, the state-owned Sverdlov explosives plant in Dzerzhinsk. 2 years, one recipient, tens of thousands of tons of reactive acid. That's not a delivery for agriculture. That's the pantry of a munitions factory. And what happens to those acids there? They become octogen and hexogen, better known in the West as HMX and RDX. These are the warheads that sit inside heavy artillery shells, not the steel casing, not the powder that pushes the shell out of the barrel, the actual explosive in the head, the part that goes off when the round lands. Without it, a shell is an expensive metal paperweight. With it, it's a weapon that takes a bunker apart. Picture the whole thing as a bakery. The front fires the bread, thousands of loaves a day, each one spent downrange. The explosives plant in Dzerzhinsk is the oven the bread is baked in. But no oven on earth bakes without flour, and Azot in Novomoskovsk was one of the mills that ground that flour. Now think about which is smarter, chasing every single loaf at the front one after another while it already sits sliced on the table, or simply stopping the mill before the flour even exists. Ukraine chose the mill. There's another point that makes this one address so explosive. A fertilizer company isn't a secret arms plant. It's on no list of banned weapons factories. It doesn't hide it. Openly produces what farmers buy worldwide. That for years was its protection. Who would have guessed that the acid for the field ends up in the warhead that plows a trench? Ukraine saw through that cover and called it by name. And just like that, it's gone. This is the logic behind the whole night. Russia's war is at its core an artillery war. It isn't decided by whoever has the prettiest tanks, but by whoever can keep the stream of shells running longest. That's not a weakness, it's by design. Russia has always leaned on mass over precision on the wall of steel that simply buries a position under itself. That kind of war has a price, and it's paid in tons of explosive, not in cleverness. As long as the tons keep flowing, it's a terrible working method. Choke the flow, and the whole method collapses in on itself because there's no plan B behind it. A single active front eats thousands of rounds a day. Someone has to fill each one. Someone has to make the filler. And the raw materials for it come from a surprisingly short list of plants. That short list is the weakness hiding behind the sheer mass. Hit far enough up the chain and you don't have to chase every shell down below. You turn off the tap before the water even reaches the pipe. Do the rough math yourself. Hit an ammo dump at the front and you destroy maybe a few thousand shells, painful but replaceable by the next supply train. Hit the plant that supplies the explosive for millions of future shells, and you destroy not today's ammunition, but tomorrow's, the day after's, next month's. The one is a wound. The other is a bleed that doesn't stop. And now line up the 3 targets of that night. Azot supplies the chemistry that fills the shells. Vyazma through its tracks moves the guns and the ammunition. Temp near Rybinsk stores the fuel that keeps the whole machine moving. Chemistry rail fuel. 3 cuts into the same artery in a single night. These aren't 3 randomly burning depots. It's one idea executed 3 times. Aim like that, and you don't want to torch a few tanks. You want to drain the supply itself. And don't forget how hard a night like this is to pull off in the first place. 3 targets hundreds of kilometers apart, almost the same hour. That means routes planned, air defense flown around each drone's fuel, and payload calculated to the gram, all of it timed together. That's no lucky hit from a single machine. It's a machine of its own, running like clockwork and choosing its targets by function, not by headline. It fits a pattern bigger than this one night. Just a few days earlier, the security service SBU, the military intelligence HUR, and special forces had jointly hit the Taman-of-Tigris marine terminal in the south. 5 fuel reservoirs and 2 loading arms destroyed. The largest oil export port in southern Russia was left standing on shaky legs. For months, Ukraine had aimed at the ports the oil leaves the country through. Now it's also aiming at the factories inland where the chemistry for the shells is made. 2 taps shut almost simultaneously the fuel that moves the army and the chemistry that feeds its artillery. One slows the legs, the other takes the punch out of the fist. Step back for a second and look at how far this idea has come. Early in the war, Ukrainian drones hit whatever was in range. A depot here, an airfield there, often more symbol than effect. Then came the refineries, and pinpricks turned into a campaign against the oil that fills Russia's coffers. Now on this night, the next stage is visible, no longer just the money and the fuel, but the raw materials of the weapons themselves. Each stage sits deeper in the machine. This one sits all the way down at the root. And there's a reason the root hurts most. Money can be shifted around, or oil can if it has to be pulled from other sources. But a country has only a handful of plants that supply the right chemistry in this volume. Knock one out and the load shifts on to the rest, and those are already running flat out. It's like a bridge on 4 piers. Take one away, and the other 3 suddenly carry a load they were never built for. And one detail from that night shows how systematic all of this is. Temp near Rybinsk was no new target. It had already burned on New Year's Eve. The fact that Ukraine hits the same facility again 6 months later means something specific. It keeps a list. It doesn't just check targets off, it comes back. It checks whether the hole is still open or whether Russia has long since patched it. An army that visits its targets twice isn't chasing headlines. It's keeping books on the enemy, and it has patience. And don't forget the fuel, because it tells the same story from another direction. An army that can't drive doesn't fight. Tanks, trucks, generators, all of it drinks diesel. Hit the refineries, and on top of that, the strategic reserve like Temp, and you force the enemy to redistribute his scarce fuel away from the market toward the front. And that is exactly what's starting to show. More on that at the end. And why can't Russia just replace all of this overnight? Because plants like these don't sit on every street corner. Specialized chemistry needs specialized facilities, built over years, with permits, reactors, and experts you don't pick up at the hardware store. Sanctions make it expensive and slow to source missing precursors abroad in a hurry. And the shorter the supplier list, the harder the loss of a single name on it lands. A single address, exactly the one you should remember. Knock it out and a gap opens that can't be closed with a phone call. But now I have to be honest, because this is where the solid ground ends. How hard Azot itself was hit, we don't know. What's confirmed is the fire and the hot spots through cross-referenced geodata through NASA satellites. How much was actually destroyed inside the plant, no one outside the factory walls has shown yet. It could be a hit that cripples production for months. It could be a fire at the edge that disrupts operations only briefly and is forgotten in 2 weeks. No one knows that difference with certainty right now, and that exact difference decides whether this night becomes a turning point or a footnote. Anyone selling you one or the other as a sure thing is just guessing. So what happens next? 3 paths are possible, and they lead to very different places. The first path Ukraine keeps at it. It hits the chemistry not once, but again and again, plant by plant, node by node, over weeks. Then Russian fire at the front drops not tomorrow, but noticeably over time. Shells get rationed. Attacks Russia used to bury under steel suddenly cost it deliberation because every round gets scarcer. It's the slow path, but the deepest. The second path Russia reroutes. It dips into its stockpiles, buys ammunition where it still can from North Korea, for instance, and finds new suppliers for the chemistry somewhere somehow. Then the rate of fire holds. And this night stays a pinprick, not a cut. Impressive on video without consequence on the map. The third path Russia answers with force. It strikes back at Ukraine's power grid at plants and substations the way it has every winter before. Then it isn't the logistics that escalates, but the retaliation, and the price gets paid in Ukrainian apartments with no electricity. History knows this pattern well. Armies have rarely starved at the front. They've starved in the factories and on the rails behind it long before the last shot was fired. Hit the supply, and you don't win a battle in a day. You win it over weeks, almost unnoticed, until the enemy suddenly can't go on. And amid all the maps and curves, don't forget what stands at the other end of this chain. Less explosive in Dzerzhinsk means eventually fewer shells at the front. Fewer shells means a Russian assault that would otherwise bury a position under 100 impacts suddenly has to make do with 20. For the Ukrainian soldier in that exact trench, this isn't an abstract chart. It's the difference between lying still in cover and raising your head to fire back. Up at the top of the chain, a factory gets hit. Down at the bottom, it decides who survives an assault. Where do I place my bet on the first path, but only on one condition, that Ukraine actually keeps the pace? Because the short supplier list and the sanctions make fast replacement expensive and sluggish. Hit far up the chain and stay hit there, and you feel it down below, even if it takes weeks to reach the front. A single night shuts down one mill. Only 10 such nights shut down the bakery. Honestly, the truth probably lands somewhere between the first two paths. Russia will reroute as best it can and lose something anyway. The question isn't whether a hole opens, but how fast it can be filled. That pace decides everything. But I'll also tell you what would prove me wrong, because a bet with no exit is just a wish. If Russian artillery fire doesn't ease off over the next 3 to 6 weeks, if suddenly far more shells start flowing in from North Korea, if Russian industry shows it can reroute the chemistry faster than Ukraine can hit the plants. If any one of those happens this night was impressive to watch, and without strategic consequence. There's even a sign that points both ways. If the flow of North Korean shells jumps, that's on the one hand proof that Russia can no longer cover its own production. On the other, it would be exactly the exit that tips my bet over. The same signal, two readings. That's how blurry this war is. Until then, patience. The effect of a strike on the supply chain doesn't show up on the next evening's news. It shows up in curves that slowly bend down in rates of fire in delivery numbers in what no longer reaches the front. Anyone waiting for a quick bang here hasn't understood the game. It's a bet on the mechanism, not on a date on the calendar. And bets can be lost. If I'm right, you'll spot it in small signs long before anyone admits it officially. Watch whether Russian artillery fire goes quieter on individual stretches of the front, whether reports of shell shortages start piling up. Watch whether Ukraine sends its drones against chemical plants more often than refineries from here on, because that would be the admission that the mill pays off better than the tank. And watch the fuel. A major Russian oil company has already limited fuel sales nationwide. One tap after another, quietly shut with no big announcement. Keep an eye on it. And one more thing, watch what Russia doesn't say. If the fires stay unclear in cause, if the closures get more frequent, if numbers vanish from the reports, then you're not hitting empty air. You're hitting something that hurts. Silence in this war is often the most honest admission there is. Share this with someone who needs to see it and subscribe so you never miss the next breakdown. That leaves a bigger question, and I'll leave you with it. For centuries, wars were decided at the front, in the mud between the trenches where the men stood. This night suggests another possibility that the next great war won't be lost where the shells land, but where the acid is made that they're built from. A fertilizer plant, a rail depot, a fuel depot. 3 quiet places far behind the front that suddenly say more about the outcome of this war than any battle in the headlines. What do you think?